In the last tutorial we looked at how we made Mistika autoconform from clip files and link files. So we now know how we can autoconform from movies and assets that we present to the system. But Mistika has another trick up its sleeve when it comes to autoconforming. It can not only conform from any media that it's already aware of, no matter what project it's in, because of course the autoconform process can be shown where link files and clip files exist. But actually Mistika can also conform from work and timelines that we've previously created. So in this example what we're going to do is use a new EDL that represents a trailer of the film that's on the timeline in front of us at the moment. Now as we can see, this film has some shots, some color grades, some reframing, some cropping, etc. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to present an EDL to this timeline to basically conform from this timeline. Now of course if I go through the normal conform process and tell the conform process where the clip file or link files are, then I'd end up with a conform of just clips. But what I really want is a conform of the clips along with the color grades or the crops or reframes or anything else that I've already done in this timeline. I could render this entire timeline into a movie and conform from that, but then I'd end up with a conform made solely of pre-rendered clips, which meant that I wouldn't have access to any of this metadata to go back and make changes. So let's firstly look at the fundamental process of how we go about using existing work as a target for the conform, and then we'll look at a couple of scenarios. So the first issue is what we actually conform from. As I mentioned, if we conform from clip files or link files, we're only going to get exactly that, the original source media. However, if we go back into our conform tab and look at Mistika clips, we can see that one of the options for an extension was .rnd. So we have link files, clip files. A .rnd is a render file. As we briefly explored when we looked at the media browser tutorial, when we render something, for example if I just render this clip, then Mistika creates the piece of media for our render, and that is actual media. But also what it creates, if we look in the media browser, it's created a folder called my clip, which is what I said the clip should be called, and it's created two objects. One is a green clip file, and that represents, if I double click it onto the timeline, a reference to the media itself, so it's just a copy of that. However, the purple one actually represents everything that was required to make that clip. So if I page down into this group, we can see everything's in there from the source material upwards. So the .rnd files don't contain any media as such, so they're tiny in file size. But they contain a reference to where the source clips are, as well as data of every single process that we've done to that clip. In fact, even if we'd painted on this clip, it would remember every single paint stroke. So we can use these .rnd files as a target for our conform. And therefore our conform won't consist of simple flat clips. Our resultant conform will contain the original clip and everything we've done to it. So let's try some scenarios. Let's say that this was a film we made last week. Since then, it's gone back to the editor to cut a trailer, and now he's presenting us with a new EDL for the trailer. He might have gone two ways about it. He might have cut from the original footage, which means that his EDL contains the timecode references to each individual shot. Or he might have taken a movie file of this particular film and cut from that, in which case his timecodes will perhaps reference the timecode of the timeline. So let's look at how to deal with both of those. Either way, the first thing I need to do is to create a target for the conform. So in essence, what I want to do is create a render file or files that I can then present to the conform process. So let's firstly look at the option where the editor has used the original source rushes. So the timecode on his EDL relates to the original rushes, not to my timeline. In essence, it relates to these. So what I want to do is create a render file for every single one of these clips. And I can do that simply by selecting my edit and bringing up the edit marks. I press the U shortcut key, but it's effectively this button here. And then it doesn't matter what formats I choose for the render, because I'm actually going to press this button when I want to render, which is only write the script file, only create those little .rnd files. It's not actually going to create any media for me, because I'm not interested in the media at this point. I'm interested in the data of how the media is created. So let's just give this a name. Let's call it from rushes, because that's where we know the timecode is going to be referenced to in the EDL. And one key thing here is I need to change this segment mode. I need to put it onto split to segments. The difference is, if it's set as one segment, Mistika will create a single piece of media, a single movie file effectively, that covers all of this. I actually want one for every single thing. The reason I want one for every single thing is that, of course, all of these have their own time codes that happily jump around. So I don't want a single piece of media with ascending timecode. I want individual pieces of media that respect the original timecodes. So the first thing I do to make Mistika do that is under segment mode, I set split to segments. This will force it to render every single one of those clips individually. The second thing I do is say where I want it to get its source name from. So in this case, I'm going to say that I want to use the source clip name, because of course the EDL is going to refer to this. So I want transparency. I want my rendered files to have the same tape names, as it were, as the original source tapes. And then the second thing is I also want the timecode to be taken from the original files as well. So now if I press this button, write script only, we'll see what happens. As you can see, Mistika has zipped along the timeline, creating what effectively are bits of empty media. But that in itself is not what I'm interested in. So I'm just to keep my timeline clean, I'm just going to hit delete immediately. Because what's interesting now is if I go into my media browser, we can see that it's created a folder under data render called from rushes. Remember, that's what I called it. And if I open it, we can see it's created all these render files. And notice how it's maintained the original name, and they'll also have the original time codes as well. So this folder I can now use as a target for my conform. So let's try that. So I'll go to conform, Mistika Clips, EDL. So here I've got a EDL which is trailer from rushes. And we can check that because we can see that it's referring to the original file names and the original time codes. So I want to get the tape names from the real name column. I need to point it to where those render files are, here. And I just need to ensure that it's looking for render files. Let's perform that. And immediately it's created an environment for us. Double click to load it. And there we have our conform. And inside each one of those groups is the data that built each one of those clips, which means that in the context of my new conform, I start with everything exactly as it was in the master film, but I have access to all those settings. So that was using an EDL that referred to the original rushes, names and time codes. Let's look at the other way of doing it. So I'm going to go back to my original master file. Imagine that rather than cut from his original rushes, at the end of the last session when we finished this film, the editor took away a movie file of this film. He's loaded that up into his Avid or Final Cut or whatever, and he's cut a trailer from it. So now our EDL no longer has any knowledge of these original source clips. Rather, it simply knows that our film starts at 0 and ends however long later. Well, we can still make things work that way as well. So going back to our Output tab, we'll go through the same process, because what we want to do is create a render script that is appropriate for that style of EDL. So in this instance, what we're going to do is we'll change our name to say from master. This is just a name, by the way, it doesn't mean anything. In here, we're not going to split the segments. We're going to have it as one single segment, because remember, the editor took away a single movie file, so we're looking to replicate that. And in this case, we want the timeline name. Actually, this one's probably irrelevant, because it doesn't really matter what the name is. There's only going to be one clip. But certainly, from the timecode source, we want to use the timeline timecode. And now again, we can press Write Script Only. And you can see this time we've got a single piece of media that starts at 0. So again, delete that because that's of no interest to us at all. What is interesting to us is under the media browser, we now have a From Master, which has the RND clip, which incidentally you could load straight to the timeline if you want to, and inside that group is everything that made that film. That's actually what the autoconform is looking for. So let's go back to our conform process. This time we'll choose the trailer from master EDL that I've got, and as you can see here, all the real names are the same because it's coming from the same movie file in terms of what the editor started with. And we can see from our time codes here all starting with 00, so none of these are referring to rushes. What I'm going to do with looking for the source name is actually say, don't bother, don't look for the source name. The reason is the EDL refers specifically to the name of the QuickTime or whatever it was that the editor loaded. So I could have been careful to match that when I created my render script, but actually who cares? We know it's only coming from one thing, and we know that these time codes must be unique. So I'm going to tell it don't even bother look at the real name. And again, we give it our root path. Just going to refresh that because it's not appeared on here yet. There it is. So from master. So it appears in here. And we're still on looking for render files as the target. So simply click perform. And again, it's now created an environment trailer from master for us. It always adds underscore converted EDL, so you know that it's a Mistika generated timeline. Double click that. And there we have our conform. Now, an interesting aspect here is, of course, because we conformed from a whole master, if we open up any one of these groups, or rather if we page down to have a look inside the group, we can actually see the entire edit is inside each group. And the purple marks simply delineate which bit of that master is being brought upwards from the group. Now you can imagine these groups, sooner or later you're going to want to ungroup them if you want to change anything. Now if I just ungroup this particular group, it's going to make quite a mess. As you can see, it's opened the entire edit. So if I did that for every group on the timeline, I'd be in a very deep mess. Fortunately, Mistika has a tool precisely for that reason, which is under Edit and Macros. There is Trim and Ungroup. In other words, it'll ungroup and get rid of anything that wasn't actually being isolated by the grouping process. So, macro, trim and ungroup, and you can see that only the relevant part of the group has been revealed. And in fact, so long as I have under Edit set up Auto Expand enabled, then in fact I can simply lasso everything and go macro, trim and group. And even where we were going through a dissolve, we can see that Mistika has properly ensured that this clip, which is color corrected and cropped, is correctly mixed back to this clip, which is color corrected. So using this method of creating, if you like, false media with an R&D script, we can create some quite interesting workflows. Another variant of this, for example, is to be able to be working on rushes whilst the editing process is taking place. So for example, camera rushes arrive straight at Mistika, perhaps in a dailies workflow, ready for a version to be converted and sent to the editor. Meanwhile, Mistika can carry on with grading or fixing or VFX, knowing that when the edit list comes back from the editor, all that work in progress can simply be mopped up into a conform without having to mix down or render down in order to provide a target for the conform.